Life in a picturesque, gated neighborhood often carries a deceptive charm. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and a relentless expectation of conformity hide something darker beneath the surface. Power-hungry neighbors with nothing better to do than police everyone else's existence. When I first moved into Pine Ridge Estates, I believed I was buying into peace, a fresh start, a refuge from chaos. What I walked into instead was suburban warfare, ruled by an HOA queen who treated the community like her personal kingdom. Her name was Marlene, though the whispered nickname given to her by multiple fed-up residents was much more fitting. The Karen of Pine Ridge. She wasn't elected. She simply seized control of the HOA board years ago and never let go. She exercised authority with a manic commitment to surveillance, eagerly documenting even the smallest of perceived violations like a hawk watching for prey. Her home security cameras pointed outward, ready to catch a neighbor in the act of existing incorrectly. My first clash with her wasn't monumental. A warning letter accusing me of having a mailbox flag that violated uniform aesthetic standards. I dismissed it, figuring she had to manufacture reasons to keep busy. But soon enough, annoyances snowballed into full-blown harassment. Seasonal wreaths were a problem. My garden hose color was a problem. Even the way I parked on my own driveway became objectionable material. Every letter ended with a threat of escalating fines. Each stamped envelope felt like another shove toward compliance. I refused to bend, and she did not appreciate resistance. But the true conflict ignited when winter approached. I installed a beautiful stone fire pit behind my house near the woods. I imagined cozy evenings, warmth under the stars, and maybe roasting marshmallows if I felt whimsical. I ordered cords of seasoned oak firewood, stacking them neatly beside the pit. The fresh wood smell reminded me of camping trips from childhood. It felt like the first real moment of peace I'd had since moving there. That peace lasted less than a week. The first time the wood went missing, I assumed a contractor or delivery mix-up was responsible. Maybe someone else had been expecting a shipment. I called the firewood company. They confirmed the delivery and offered to check with other customers. They returned my call later saying no one reported a missing order. It was odd, but I let it go. Then it happened again. A larger stack, gone without a trace. The air around the storage area looked disturbed. Footprints in the frosted dirt leading toward one direction, straight behind Marlene's home. A suspicion flickered like a spark in dry timber. Still, I tried to remain rational. Animals? Neighborhood teens? High demand for firewood during cold weather? Many possibilities existed, until I witnessed the truth with my own eyes. One night, while taking trash to the curb, I spotted movement near my backyard. A figure in a fluffy, excessively fashionable coat, one I recognized from HOA meetings, sneaking near the fire pit. The glint of a wheelbarrow appeared in the moonlight as logs were loaded by hurried, manic hands. Each piece disappeared over property lines like contraband. It was her. The HOA Karen was stealing my firewood. I stood frozen, stupefied by the absurdity. This wasn't just petty theft. This was entitlement personified. Pine Ridge's queen apparently believed all wood inside the neighborhood fell under her jurisdiction, too. The next day, I found a fresh letter taped to my door. Not mailed, hand-delivered like a personal challenge. It claimed that outdoor fire pits were prohibited within the community and demanded I remove mine immediately. She referenced no policy, only her own authority. The letter also stated that any unapproved flammable materials stored outdoors could be subject to HOA redistribution for safety purposes. Redistribution. An elegant word for theft. The nerve was infuriating. She had stolen from me and then crafted paperwork to justify the crime retroactively. I realized then that confronting her through official channels would achieve nothing. She was the law here, at least in her own mind, and anyone who questioned her found themselves drowning in fines or constant surveillance. I tried moving the woodpile into my garage, hoping to avoid further incidents, but each time I replenished the supply, it vanished within days, and the wheelbarrow tracks always pointed back to the same place. She was stalking my property, waiting, watching, and the more she stole, the bolder she became. She no longer bothered being stealthy. She'd march right through my backyard in broad daylight, acting like she was collecting fallen branches from a public park. A smug tilt of her chin always followed, as if daring me to challenge her authority. I documented everything: photos, videos, dates, and times logged. I planned to call the sheriff if it continued, but neighbors warned me privately with weary eyes. Reporting her could trigger retaliation far worse than wood theft. She'd make it her mission to destroy my ability to live peacefully in the neighborhood. Some residents even confessed she had sabotaged property sales of people who dared oppose her, leaving them trapped until they surrendered. The woman was a tyrant with a clipboard. I lay awake night after night, envisioning ways to reclaim my power. Filing police reports felt too slow. Taking the matter to the HOA board was pointless. It was full of her loyal lapdogs. Talking to her directly would only inflame things, and every day, the firewood situation worsened while she stripped my logs for her own fireplace like some twisted heat-seeking vulture. What made her think she could take whatever she wanted? What drove her to govern everyone else's belongings? Anger fermented into something darker, something clever. I didn't want petty revenge. I wanted poetic justice that exposed her as the tyrant she was. I wanted a fallout she couldn't deny. The idea struck one evening while browsing woodworking videos online. A craftsman hollowed out logs, filling them with fireworks for New Year's. The sparks inside the wood looked harmless from outside until combustion transformed everything into chaotic, explosive brilliance. My thoughts drifted to gunpowder. Theoretically, a hollow log could be filled with small, legal exploding components. Firework powder, reloading powder. Nothing extreme, nothing lethal, just enough force to create a shock and a message. Not enough to injure someone seriously, but enough to ensure anyone who stole the wrong log would instantly regret their life choices. I began researching, carefully, quietly. If I pulled this off, I couldn't afford mistakes. Everything had to look normal. The logs needed to appear just like the others she kept stealing. The plan took shape like a trap door beneath her feet. I would bait her with exactly what she craved. Firewood that looked identical. Firewood that waited patiently. The next time she stole from me, the consequences would be loud. My pulse quickened at the thought. A sense of control I hadn't felt since moving into Pine Ridge surged through me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing a counterstrike. The queen of the HOA was about to learn that every tyrant eventually meets someone who refuses to kneel. Winter deepened. Night crept earlier and colder, and as frost thickened across the lawns of Pine Ridge Estates, my mind sharpened with a single objective: make her pay. Once resentment becomes a rhythm, it plays on repeat in the back of the mind, an insistent drumbeat that nudges every waking hour. For days I lived inside that beat, imagining confrontations, fantasies of public humiliation, and revenge staged with the precision of a viral video. The idea that had first struck like a reckless spark, hollow logs filled with something that would make a thief regret their choices, kept returning in different forms. Each iteration was louder, meaner, bolder. Each time it felt a little less like justice and a little more like escalation. There was a very particular appeal to the theatrical. Pine Ridge thrived on spectacle. The dramatic HOA hearings, the passive-aggressive lawn ornaments, the way gossip rippled through the neighborhood faster than rainwater. A stunt that exposed her could topple her crown not with violence, but with the humiliation of being caught on camera, of having her hypocrisy broadcast in full, embarrassing clarity. That line between spectacle and harm thinned dangerously in my mind, but it also offered an out. Expose the thief without causing real injury. Make a scene. Make it undeniable. Make it stick. I obsessed over optics. Viral videos that broke out of suburban outrage were always elegant in their simplicity. Clear evidence, undeniable action, and an unambiguous villain. If I staged the right moment, if I baited the theft and recorded it from two angles, I wouldn't need to inflict pain to win. Justice would come from exposure, not explosion. Even so, the darker idea continued to shadow me. The memory of the hollow log videos I'd seen online refused to leave. The notion of something that looked harmless but carried a sting of consequence fascinated me. The promise of instant, dramatic reaction. I never allowed myself to move beyond the thought into any technical detail. I refused to research materials or methods. There was a line I would not cross. I would not learn how to make things that could hurt people. I would not become the kind of person who weaponized their neighbor's curiosity. But a plan that relied solely on a recording had its own complications. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed cameras were for other people. She had the gall to glare at a phone recording her and file a complaint claiming harassment. Her arsenal included paperwork, neighbors willing to swear by her righteousness, and a thinly veiled network of petty retaliation. Viral proof needed to be airtight. It needed corroboration without the possibility of ambiguity. So I pivoted to a hybrid. The bait would be visual and theatrical, but benign in impact. No shards, no flames, no clandestine powders. Instead, I imagined logs that fooled the eye but betrayed the thief with a harmless spectacle. A puff of colored smoke that left no lasting harm. A loud yet harmless pop that would startle and reveal, or confetti that would cling to clothing and hair, an undeniable signature of taking the wood. The goal wasn't to injure, it was to create a moment so undeniable and ridiculous that denial would be impossible. This felt like a moral compromise I could live with. If she was going to steal and then weaponize HOA rules to justify theft, I could weaponize exposure. A public shaming that was messy and theatrical would undo her in a way fines never could. It would make the neighborhood laugh at her, and in Pine Ridge, social capital was everything. Construction of the bait required craft more than chemistry. The logs had to look and weigh right. They had to match the grain and the weathering of the rest. If they looked different, she wouldn't touch them. If they rattled or smelled off, she'd sniff them out. The art of deception wasn't in the danger it posed, but in the authenticity of the object. I worked quietly in my garage, selecting pieces that matched the stack she favored. I sanded and stained, choosing knots and scars carefully so the wood would read as ordinary from a distance. While preparing the bait, I took every precaution to shield myself from suspicion. I documented purchases, kept receipts, and made a show of hauling the new wood into the yard in daylight where neighbors could see me. An ostentatious display of innocence. I spoke to no one about specifics. I recorded rehearsals of camera angles, checking sight lines from my backyard, the side yard, and the little hill that sloped toward the street. I mapped escape routes and staging zones. I prepared the phone that would serve as my primary camera and hid a second, more discreet lens across the fence. I planted silent witnesses in the form of written notes in the event my devices failed. I would leave visible, dated markers near the pile, literal breadcrumbs of ownership. Days stretched like thick rope. Each night I tested the bait logs, ensuring only that they looked ordinary. I refused to test anything that could cause harm. The entire scheme relied on optics and timing, not on sabotage. Still, the fantasies of more dangerous retribution flitted through my mind like moths to a porch light. I caught myself smiling at the imagined gasp if something dramatic occurred. The smile always curdled into unease. There was a thin line between being clever and being cruel. I would not cross it. The neighborhood, predictably, provided spectators. People who had watched the initial skirmishes with helpless amusement now began to notice me more actively. The woman 2 houses down, whose begonias Marlene once threatened with fines, gave me a conspiratorial nod. The retired mail carrier, who'd seen more petty combat than anyone else in the cul-de-sac, offered the quiet understanding of someone who had watched empires crumble over less. Even the barista at the corner cafe leaned in when I mentioned the pile, eyes gleaming with the potential viral storytelling. Through it all, I kept one more thing in mind: the law. Theft was a crime, so was setting a trap that caused injury. If the plan required me to stand on the same moral high ground of the neighborhood statutes I'd been accused of violating, the scheme would be hollow. Exposure had to be clean, incontrovertible, and above reproach. I imagined the HOA meeting where a video would play, and the sound that would accompany it would be the collective gasps of people who finally recognized what they were living next to. Not a hiss of burning or the clang of an impact, but the small, sharp laugh of the community when the veil was lifted. I rehearsed the sequence in my head until it became choreography. Place the bait. Wait. Capture. Reveal. The thrill of anticipation felt like prepping for a performance. But unlike performance art, the audience here had real power. They could vote her out of the board, refuse to sign her petitions, and, most importantly, remove her social license to police the neighborhood. The weather turned the way weather always did in Pine Ridge, indifferent to conspiracies. Snow threatened, then retreated. The nights grew longer. The fire pit sat cold and patient, a monument to the conflict that had begun over a stack of wood. I worried the longer I waited, the more likely she'd change patterns or someone else would take the bait. Timing, I knew, was everything. On the morning I decided to act, the air had a brittle edge. I moved with the silent confidence of someone who had rehearsed too many times to be nervous anymore. The bait logs looked as ordinary as wood could look. I stacked them among the rest, the seam indistinguishable to the untrained eye. I positioned cameras with a meticulousness bordering on obsession. I left a visible note on the pile, a dated, hand-scrawled tag that read simply as proof of ownership, an undeniably human marker. Then I did the hardest thing. I waited and tried very hard not to think. The afternoon crept toward dusk. I trimmed hedges, adjusted patio chairs, and tried to appear entirely uninterested. Neighbors passed in pairs, their eyes flicking to my yard with the curiosity of an audience waiting for a show. Marlene, meanwhile, had been uncharacteristically absent from public view for a string of days. Perhaps she had family visiting. Perhaps she was plotting. Perhaps she was simply enjoying the illusion of invulnerability. That last possibility made me the most nervous. As the sun flattened into the horizon, a shadow moved across the yard. The wheelbarrow tracks I'd learned to recognize like a disgraced signature appeared again in the soft earth. Heart thudding in my throat, I turned toward the camera viewfinder and felt the world compress into a rectangle of glass where the next moment would unfold. The moment that would decide whether I had engineered triumph or disaster. A silent breath. The camera blinked red. The thief stepped into frame. The night held its breath with us. The moment arrived with the same suddenness as a thunderclap. One instant the night was ordinary. The next, it was a spectacle. From the viewfinder, the yard looked calm, a rectangle of suburban normalcy. But the camera had always been a lie by omission. Hidden angles recorded everything the main lens could not. A second device caught a side profile, a gate, the flourish with which someone who believed themselves untouchable did what they always did. When the wheelbarrow creaked into frame and a familiar silhouette stooped to take what was not hers, the scene snapped into focus like a headline settling into a feed. What happened next felt unreal because it was designed to be absurd rather than dangerous. The bait performed exactly as intended, an immediate public reveal that left no room for plausible deniability. instead of sparks or pulverizing force, ideas that had no place in a plan meant to be legal and moral. The logs betrayed their thief with a theatricality that belonged at an over-the-top street festival. A sudden burst of confetti and a puff of harmless colored smoke erupted, clinging to clothing and hair, painting the thief with carnival humiliation. The sound was a sharp, ridiculous pop that cut across the sleepy cul-de-sac like a laugh, an audio puncture that announced the act to the whole block. There was a collective intake of breath across the neighborhood. Lights blinked on, heads poked out of blinds. The woman, Marlene, froze as if some part of her had recognized the scene before the mind could process it. For a beat that felt like an impossibly long commercial, she stood coated in confetti, her expression a study in disbelief and fury. The reaction that followed could not have been scripted better for virality. A frantic attempt to wipe away the evidence, the fast, practiced motion of someone trying to reclaim dignity while admitting nothing, and the unmistakable tilt of entitlement that had defined her for years. My cameras ate every second. The wide angle captured the whole tableau. The wheelbarrow, the smoke, the confetti, the way Marlene moved, and the close-up recorded the incriminating details. The date tag fluttering on the pile, the fingerprints on a log, the exact moment her hands closed around someone else's property. Social media-ready footage, stripped of ambiguity. The night was suddenly a live performance, and every neighbor unwittingly became the audience. Within minutes, a ripple of activity rolled through Pine Ridge. Phones lit up with the same clip, forwarded by the neighbor who'd been watching from behind a curtain. Someone had stepped outside and shouted across lawns, "Go look!" The spectacle's absurdity and the clarity of the footage combined into something combustible. Not in the literal sense, but in terms of social reaction. People emailed the clip to each other. Messages flew in private groups. The narrative was instant and damning. Here was the woman who policed minor infractions being caught in a petty, humiliating theft. Marlene did what power brokers often do when their script collapses. She tried to rewrite history. She removed the confetti with furious hands and attempted to smother the smoke with the back of her sleeve. Her steps were purposeful. She marched across my lawn as though she had rights to it, her face a study in righteous indignation. Her gait had always been part of her armor. Slow, measured, the way someone who expected to be obeyed moved through a world they regarded as their domain. Neighbors came into the yard. Some approached cautiously, as if entering a courtroom where the verdict might change with the next piece of testimony. Others laughed because the spectacle was impossible to ignore. The two sides of our community, those who quietly resented her and those who still feared her, reacted as they always did. Some with private, satisfied smiles and others with a twitch of protective instinct for the woman who had long been their self-appointed moral compass. It was all there in the footage. The theft, the tag, Marlene's hurried attempts to cast doubt. There was no ambiguity in the clip, and that was its entire power. Evidence is an unforgiving thing when it arrives in high definition and is paired with a soundtrack of collective reaction. The clip spread like spilled fuel across dry tinder. Within 24 hours, it had been watched by most of Pine Ridge, reposted in neighborhood forums, and embedded into the messaging. Threads of people who had been waiting for a reason to act. The first formal consequences were pecuniary and bureaucratic, the sort of mundane things HOA leaders hide behind to feel like they've fixed something. Complaints filed en masse, requests for emergency board meetings, calls to the property manager asking for an explanation, petitions circulated with signatures like currency, voting informal but loud, enough to force a hearing. Marlene, predictably, doubled down. She sent an email to the neighborhood listserv that read like a manifesto, self-righteous, detailed, and performed for an audience that could still be swayed. In it, she reframed herself as the victim of a harassment campaign, accusing an unidentified neighbor of staging an embarrassment. She hinted at legal recourse and invoked words like privacy violation and defamation, trying to turn the event into a moral question instead of a clear case of theft caught on camera. Her phrasing contained the practiced evasions of someone who had litigated social situations for years, but video and the weight of numbers were not the only weapons in play. She began to move behind the scenes, a familiar choreography, phone calls to sympathetic neighbors, quiet meetings with board members who owed their positions to her influence, attempts to delegitimize the evidence by attacking the messenger. If there was a playbook for regaining control after public exposure, Marlene knew it by heart. Even as the community buzzed, the legal world loomed. The clip was damning but not dispositive in court terms. Caught on camera has raw power in a neighborhood, but needs backing when the lawyers come knocking. I consulted an attorney to understand my options and obligations. What counts as legal evidence? How to handle harassment claims? What retaliation might look like? The counsel was practical and steady. Preserve all footage, document every interaction, and avoid anything that could be construed as entrapment or an invitation to escalate. That word, entrapment, hung in the air like a moral guillotine. Had I crossed a line by setting a theatrical trap? Friends and some neighbors were unequivocal. No, I had not. The logs were mine, the tag marked proof of ownership, and the act of stealing was her choice. Others whispered that I had been reckless. That humiliation could be weaponized against the wrong person, and that community fracture could be irreparable. Marlene's next move was predictable and petty. She filed a formal complaint, claiming invasion of privacy and seeking fines against me for creating a public disturbance. She alleged that the confetti and smoke had endangered children and animals, an allegation with emotional traction in a place where the littlest risk could become the biggest scandal. Her letter was performative, full of righteous indignation and the careful legalese of someone who knew how to weaponize bureaucracy. The HOA convened an emergency meeting, the room filled with the residents who had watched every episode of this slow-burning drama and craved resolution. Some wanted immediate expulsion of Marlene from the board. Some wanted her forgiven if she returned the wood, which, absurdly, she did not. Others wanted a mediated sit-down. The board's loyalties, predictably, cleaved along lines of fear and favor. I sat in the meeting as the clip played on a loop, faces shifting. The sound of the pop echoed in the room, and I felt the weird sensation of being both vindicated and vulnerable. The footage had done what I'd intended. It exposed behavior and clarified a truth that had been hidden under years of petty rules and manufactured authority. But the aftermath proved that exposing a problem is never the same thing as solving it. The spectacle had changed everything, but whether it would change the system, her power, was another matter entirely. As the day folded into night, the neighborhood buzzed with a dozen plans for how to proceed. Some wanted to press criminal charges. Others wanted to push for a recall of the board. Some cautioned patience. Meanwhile, Marlene prepared her counterattack. Letters and legal threats already drafted in her head like ammunition. I had managed to capture the theft on camera and to paint it in a way that left no room for the petty justifications she loved. That was a small victory. But in Pine Ridge, victory meant more than a viral clip. It meant surviving the next weeks without being crushed under bureaucracy and spite. The confet. There is a moment in every suburban power struggle when spectacle gives way to strategy. The confetti had settled. The video had been shared, reshared, dissected, and memed. And the neighborhood was no longer amused spectators. They were now witnesses divided by allegiance, self-interest, and fear of reprisal. The HOA board meeting had ended not with a verdict, but with a community split so cleanly, down the middle, that it felt like the emotional equivalent of a property line staked in concrete. The days after the incident felt like walking through shifting sand. Nothing stable, everything subject to collapse. The quiet was deceptive. Outwardly, the street appeared unchanged. Lawns trimmed neatly, porch lights glowing with soft suburban warmth. But every window seemed to watch. Every closed blind suggested a conversation happening just out of earshot. The silence hummed with gossip that clung to the air like humidity. What no one could see from the outside was the meticulous effort Marlene poured into reclaiming her authority. She initiated what could only be described as a smear campaign waged through official channels. Letters arrived at regular intervals, hand-delivered to avoid any digital trace. Each envelope bore the same scripted tone, calculated concern, exaggerated victimhood, and a weaponization of HOA rulebooks she often rewrote at whim. She painted herself as a crusader, protecting the neighborhood from chaos, claiming my dangerous stunt had set a precedent that threatened the community's safety. Even the confetti became evidence in her narrative. She photographed stray pieces blown into the cul-de-sac drainage grate and included them in a presentation as proof of disregard for environmental compliance. She cited imaginary subsections of HOA bylaws as though they were gospel. Her desperation revealed itself in the way she clung to paperwork, because when authority falters, bureaucracy becomes a shield. Yet, for all her maneuvering, cracks appeared. People who had long endured her micromanagement began to speak out louder, emboldened by the clip that stripped away her veneer of righteousness. The woman whose begonias had once been deemed a violation filed a noise complaint against Marlene's late-night phone calls. The retired mail carrier submitted a sworn statement about years of petty harassment. Anonymous testimonies found their way into the complaint file like cards stacking the deck against her. The sheriff's office got involved, not dramatically, not with sirens or handcuffs, but through quiet procedural inquiries. A deputy knocked on her door to ask questions about the unauthorized removal of property. The sight alone was enough to send ripples through the street. Fear began to gnaw at her mask. What had once been her proud daily patrols, clipboard in hand, correcting the imperfections she saw in others, dwindled. She remained indoors more often, curtains drawn, neighborhood watch cameras shifting direction like panicked eyes. Her wheelbarrow disappeared from view entirely. Where she once wielded control effortlessly, now she struggled to maintain the illusion that she'd never lost it. Still, the most powerful kind of wounded pride is the kind that refuses to admit defeat. Her retaliation evolved. If confetti was my signature, paper was hers. Citations arrived weekly. Manufactured problems designed to break my resolve. A crack in my driveway, which had been there since I'd moved in, suddenly violated aesthetic guidelines. My garbage cans were placed 2 inches too far from my garage wall. A single weed sprouting between patio stones warranted a warning of escalating fines. Every letter was a reminder that for all the viral humiliation, she still controlled the machinery of the HOA. At least for now, I documented everything. I filed appeals. I responded with receipts and photographs and legal advice printed out from the attorney I'd consulted. I refused to give her easy victories, and with each pushback, another piece of her facade softened. Meanwhile, the video reached an audience she hadn't considered. Former board members who had quietly resigned years before. People who had once served alongside her contacted neighbors, expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to her. The story resurfaced old grudges buried under years of forced compliance. It was remarkable how quickly resentment, once suppressed, could resurface as collective momentum. A petition gained traction. This time, not one of her creations, but a document backed by those who sought removal rather than submission. It demanded the immediate restructuring of the HOA leadership and the termination of Marlene's position from the board. Signatures multiplied. The tide no longer favored the queen, but loss of power rarely pushes a tyrant into reflection. More often, it pushes them into their final and most desperate move. It came in the form of a certified letter addressed not to me, but to the entire neighborhood. In it, she proclaimed her intent to file civil charges. She cited defamation, malicious entrapment, and emotional distress inflicted through a staged hazard. The wording wasn't just legal, it dripped with the acidic resentment of someone who felt their empire slipping through their fingers. She insisted she would have her day in court and framed herself as the victim of an orchestrated harassment campaign. Some neighbors hesitated, nervous about conflict escalating beyond community boundaries. They feared lawyers, feared legal fees, feared any situation that could affect property values. Uncertainty smelled like opportunity to her. She latched onto that fear and wielded it like a weapon, whispering warnings that standing against her would drag everyone into costly legal messes. But the video, its clarity, its humor, its undeniable truth, was stronger than fear. Where legal maneuvers faltered, social reality prevailed. The clip reached local news outlets. A reporter from the community TV station emailed me requesting comment. The story, ridiculous as it was, fit perfectly into the modern appetite for HOA drama, suburban satire, and social justice rolled into one shareable narrative. When the news van parked outside the entrance to Pine Ridge Estates, the spectacle turned public in a way no legal threat could undo. Cameras rolled. People talked. What had once been whispered in private became spoken into microphones. Neighbors described years of unreasonable demands, arbitrary fines, and intimidation disguised as governance. This wasn't just about firewood anymore. It was about a reign of control finally being challenged. The board announced a vote of removal, an unprecedented step requiring a community meeting where the case would be presented transparently. The tension rising toward that day felt like a fuse, burning slower and slower as more eyes gathered to watch. In the days leading up to the vote, the air between houses thickened with anticipation. Some homes posted silent signs of solidarity, porch lights of the same color, small flags matching a theme, subtle symbols of unity against a bully. Others remained neutral, shutters closed, pretending nothing unusual was unfolding. On the night before the meeting, I caught a glimpse of her through her window, shoulders slightly slumped, chin trembling, eyes frantic. For the first time, the Queen looked afraid. Power is a fragile thing, and once cracks appear, people start noticing just how brittle the crown always was. As dawn approached, the stage was set. The neighborhood was ready to choose between rule by intimidation or a return to community, and I realized the strange cruelty of justice. Even when you know you are right, the final outcome is never guaranteed. By the time I stood and looked out over my yard, still bearing the faintest remnants of confetti ground into the soil, I knew that whatever came next would determine more than a single feud. It would decide whether Pine Ridge Estates remained a kingdom built on fear or became a neighborhood again. Justice, when it arrives, rarely resembles a movie moment. There is no triumphant soundtrack swelling behind decisive action, no slow-motion victory march through a cheering crowd. Sometimes, justice feels more like a deep exhale, quiet, inevitable, and long overdue. The day of the HOA board vote broke gray and cold, the kind of weather that made breath visible like whispered ghosts trailing behind everyone who filed into the community center. Coats brushed chairs, boots shuffled against cheap carpet. A collective tension pulsed through the room like static before a storm. The board members took their usual seats at the folding table. Except this time, the formation looked less like a governing body and more like an exposed group of collaborators caught in the uncomfortable spotlight of accountability. Marlene sat at the center, her customary position, but everything about her posture betrayed strain. Shoulders drawn tight, jaw clenched, hands clasped so firmly that knuckles went white. The expression she wore wasn't the smug confidence she once projected. It was the face of someone who knew the crowd wasn't on her side anymore. The meeting opened with procedure, a tedious parade of formal language meant to lend weight to what came next. But the calm didn't last. The moment the floor opened to community concerns, the room crackled to life. One by one, residents stood, voices steady, eyes sharp, recounting years of grievances. They spoke of overreach, humiliation, arbitrary punishments, threats of fines for imaginary offenses. They described surveillance cameras pointed into yards, letters that arrived weekly, and a culture of fear disguised as enforcement of order. These stories had always existed, whispered behind closed doors. But today, they were spoken aloud, visible, undeniable. The video, of course, played again, projected onto a portable screen for all to see. The crowd watched the theft unfold with a mix of vindication and disbelief that such arrogance had gone unchallenged for so long. The laughter was restrained this time, softened by the seriousness of the moment, but the ripple of amusement still spread like wind through wheat. Even the board members who once defended her couldn't hide discomfort. Their eyes flicked downward. Their loyalty wavered. When her turn came to speak, Marlene stood with the poise of someone preparing to deliver a speech she had rehearsed endlessly in front of a mirror. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was polished and theatrical. An attempt to recast herself as a misunderstood protector of community values. She spoke of her dedication, of the countless hours spent maintaining standards, of the sacrifices she made to preserve property values that benefited everyone. She framed the clip as a prank weaponized against her, a malicious attempt to undermine the HOA's authority. But the more she talked, the more transparent her desperation became, because what no self-appointed ruler ever admits is this: when power slips, the justifications offered in panic sound less like righteousness and more like noise. The vote was called. One by one, hands rose. The result wasn't close. Marlene was removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. She stood frozen for a heartbeat too long. It wasn't shock. She must have known this was coming. It was refusal, a silent protest against a reality she could not control. When she finally collected herself, she left not with dignity, but with a brittle stiffness that revealed how deeply the fall had cut. Her once commanding stride faltered. Her heels clicked too loudly on tile, each step an accidental applause marking the end of her reign. The room remained silent until the door shut behind her. And then, in slow waves, relief washed through Pine Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had avoided each other for years now spoke freely, laughing softly as the tension dissolved. The board announced interim leadership and plans to review and dismantle many of the most oppressive rules. Suggestions flew instantly: community cookouts, open yard sales, more transparency, fewer fines. The vision of what the neighborhood could become grew brighter with every exchanged glance. The sense of returning agency made the air feel lighter. There were administrative follow-ups. The sheriff concluded the inquiry quietly, dismissing Marlene's complaints once the footage made clear she had been the aggressor, not the victim. The citations she filed against me evaporated under scrutiny, dismissed as retaliatory harassment. Her legal threats, which once loomed over us like thunderheads, dissipated without so much as a rumble. As for me, I expected resentment, pockets of bitterness from those who had once defended her. Instead, I returned home to find a stack of homemade cookies on my porch and a handwritten note signed only with a single word: thanks. It was a small gesture, but it meant something profound. It was acknowledgement. It was solidarity. It was the first sign that Pine Ridge was healing. The confetti, stubborn as it was, lingered in the cracks of my patio for weeks. Tiny fragments of that wild moment would shimmer when the light hit them just right. At first I tried to sweep them away, determined to erase every trace of the chaos that had consumed the neighborhood. But gradually I stopped trying. I began to see the flecks of color not as a reminder of conflict, but as proof that even the quietest streets can harbor rebellions, and that sometimes the smallest spark can illuminate an entire community. The fire pit, once a source of contention, became a place where neighbors gathered in the evenings. Someone brought marshmallows. Someone else brought a guitar. Laughter replaced the careful silence that had once blanketed Pine Ridge. The fire crackled, sending warmth into the cold night air, and the wood burned with the unmistakable scent of peace finally reclaimed. Marlene's house grew dark in the days that followed. Curtains remained closed. Her cameras pointed inward instead of outward. The queen had barricaded herself in a shrinking kingdom of resentment, her power reduced to empty rooms and echoes of a crown no one recognized anymore. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. It carried none of the urgency she had once placed on other homes. No fines, no warnings, no complaints, just a quiet declaration that her time here was over. Some neighbors celebrated privately. Others felt pity. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of closure. Her departure wasn't marked by cheers or speeches, just a moving truck, a pair of tired-looking workers, and the fading image of a woman who had mistaken control for community. When she drove away, not a single curtain twitched to watch her go. Life in Pine Ridge Estates didn't snap back to perfection. Communities don't heal that quickly. But there was a new understanding, a shared memory that embedded itself into the soil alongside the lingering confetti. Power must serve the people, not frighten them. One evening, weeks later, I sat by the fire pit again. The flames glowed steady and bright, dancing around the last pieces of winter's wood. Above, the stars scattered across the sky like sparks frozen in time. My yard was quiet, not with fear, but with contentment. And for the first time since moving in, I felt the true promise of this neighborhood. A home should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. As the fire crackled and warm light brushed the trees, I leaned back and let myself truly relax. The battle was over. The HOA queen had fallen. The community was ours again, and the wood, finally, was safe.